Many people have argued about where the ancient Egyptians came from and what they looked like. In the past, almost every part of the world was suggested as their homeland, except, of course, Africa. Anthropologists who study racial history look at how people's bodies have changed over time. They study bones and skulls to understand these changes. Sometimes changes happen because people move around and have children with different groups, a form of intergroup mixing. Other times, changes happen naturally over thousands of years. Thus, chronology is key to the history of Kemet. We will draw your attention to the study by German Egyptologist Strauss and his group. At the time, this group deliberately dug up the mummies of Persians and Romans buried in a cemetery in Lower Egypt. They published a sensational study that showed that ancient Egyptians were from Europe and had no so-called sub-Saharan DNA. We have thoroughly debunked this piece of intellectual dishonesty. The study was so obviously racist that even Eurocentric Egyptologists did it no favors. We point this out as a note of caution when examining the persistent race-based scholarship in Kemet's history. The ancient Egyptians themselves could tell different groups apart just by looking at the shape of people's beards, skin color, and facial features. They recognized Libyans, Black Africans, and Asians as distinct peoples. In this relief, we can clearly see the people of Kemet as being no different from other black people in the greater continent of Africa. Meanwhile, European scientists have looked at more Egyptian skulls than probably any other ancient group. Egypt's dry soil and hot weather preserved bones so well that one scholar, Newbery, in 1923, said nearly every foot of ground in Egypt has some remain of its ancient people. Ancient Egyptians, best referred to as the people of Kemet, displayed subnasal prognathism, which means the lower face projects forward relative to the upper face. You can see this clearly in the Great Sphinx at Giza, which most European travelers once described as having undeniably African features. Dominique Vivant-Denon, in his book Voyage dans la Basse et la Haute Égypte pendant les campagnes du général Bonaparte, described the Sphinx as having a gentle expression, but clearly African facial traits, such as thicker lips. Constantin François Volney, an 18th century French scholar, wrote that, upon examining the Sphinx, it was obvious that ancient Egyptians had Negro features. He lamented that the very people who had founded great art and science were, in his time, subjected to enslavement. Beyond these European observers, many African scholars have stressed the African identity of ancient Egyptians. Cheikh Anta Diop, in The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, performed melanin tests on ancient Egyptian mummies, and argued that the civilization was fundamentally African, both in origin and appearance. Théophile Obenga worked alongside Diop, presenting linguistic and cultural evidence at the 1974 UNESCO Symposium in Cairo to demonstrate the African roots of ancient Egypt. Ivan van Sertima, in works like Egypt Revisited, compiled papers supporting African influences on Kemet and argued that key Egyptian features, including prognathism, align closely with other regions of Africa. The classification of African or black features relies heavily on the history of craniometry, the practice of measuring skulls to categorize human groups by race. Starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach introduced the idea of dividing humanity into different racial groups based on skull shapes. Samuel George Morton, in Crania Americana, published in 1839, measured skull volumes to argue that some races were inherently superior, an idea later debunked but influential at the time. Paul Broca and Anders Retzius continued research into cranial indices, like the cephalic index, further cementing beliefs that certain skull shapes, such as prognathism, belong to inferior races. These measures often labeled African skulls as prognathic or alveolar, emphasizing forward-facing jaws. Before the pharaohs began their dynasties, Egypt went through what scholars call the pre-dynastic period. This was a very long time, split into early, middle, and late stages. Two places in Upper Egypt, Nakada and Balas, provided the first big collections of pre-dynastic bones. Petrie and Quibel in 1896 studied skeletons from Nakada. They thought these people were a new race that came from Libya and pushed out earlier Egyptians. They claimed they saw no trace of Negro features. Soon after, De Morgan in 1897. And Fouquet also looked at the same area and decided these people were actually an old race that had lived in Egypt for a very long time. C. Fawcett in 1902 measured about 400 skulls from Nakada. She found they had long, narrow faces and flat noses, but she also saw some features that seemed modern. Later, Thompson and McIver in 1905 examined about 1,500 skulls from Upper Egypt. These bones dated from pre-dynastic times all the way to the Roman period. They noticed that the oldest Egyptians showed more Negroid traits, features linked to black Africans, while the Roman-era skulls showed fewer. From these studies, Thompson and McIver argued that the earliest ancient Egyptians came from a Negroid group, with little outside influence at the start. Then, later groups may have mixed with Libyans or other people. In another important study, Elliott Smith, 1910, found that ancient Nubians and ancient Egyptians were closely related. Nubia was in the region of modern-day Sudan, south of Egypt, and is part of Africa. So, this suggests that both groups shared African roots. For a long time, many scholars tried to place the ancient Egyptians anywhere but Africa. However, when we look at their bones, art, and writings, we see that they were firmly rooted in Africa. Studies of their skulls show many features that connect them to other African peoples. Over time, other populations may have arrived or blended in, but the base of Egyptian civilization began with African people. Today, most researchers agree that the ancient Egyptians were not from some far-off land, but were truly African, with strong ties to the surrounding areas, like Nubia. Thanks to the work of archaeologists and anthropologists, we are able to better understand how these ancient people looked and how they saw themselves. In ancient Kemet, subnasal prognathism was not viewed as a flaw. Monumental statues like the Sphinx proudly showcased African facial traits. Interestingly, in contrast, an orthodontic study found that bimaxillary protrusion, when the upper and lower front teeth stick out, making the lips appear fuller, in African Americans is often treated as a problem to be corrected, especially if it deviates from standard, often Eurocentric, orthodontic norms. The question is, why did this change happen? Many scholars point to colonization as a key turning point. Before colonization, African peoples generally did not consider their natural features undesirable. But centuries of invasions, slavery, and oppressive racial theories, supported in part by biased craniometry, shifted these attitudes. Black physical features were demeaned, leading some to see them as defects or traits to erase. Today, some black individuals seek orthodontic treatments or even skin bleaching in Africa and the Caribbean to fit in with narrow, often Eurocentric beauty ideals. This is not a criticism of personal choices, but a recognition that these choices emerge in a cultural environment shaped by colonial narratives and systemic racism. Afrocentric scholars like Chancellor Williams and John Henrik Clarke have repeatedly urged that African history and identities be reclaimed, so that features once celebrated, like full lips, broad noses, and forward jaws, no longer face unwarranted stigma. Prognathism and bimaxillary protrusion are part of a rich history of African physical diversity. Far from being oddities, these features were once held up as symbols of beauty and strength, evident in the Great Sphinx and other ancient statues. Over centuries, colonialism, racially biased science, and shifting cultural norms turned these traits into so-called conditions to correct. Yet, as the 1993 study showed, many Black Americans still value aspects of their naturally fuller profiles. Orthodontists and society at large can learn from this. Real beauty standards are broad, flexible, and strongly shaped by cultural context. As we continue to uncover and affirm the African roots of ancient civilizations like Kemet, we can also dismantle outdated ideas about which facial structures deserve praise or scorn.